Turning Tides is an AntiKs entertainment production. You can find the show on social media at the Turning Tides Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube, and at Turning Tides Pod on Bluesky and Mastodon. For more information, or if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or collaborating, please contact us at the Turning Tides Podcast at gmail.com. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Joseph Pascone, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in to this very special episode of the Turning Tides podcast. Today, we have Pete, the host of Ancient Americas, on the show. His YouTube show focuses on the prehistoric North American continent and extensively covers the history of its indigenous peoples. Pete, how are you doing today?
Doing good. Happy to be here.
Oh, well, we're happy to have you on too. I understand recently you just released an episode about the Zapotec, and that was an incredible episode that spoke a lot about the people of Oaxaca, if people aren't familiar with the Zapotec. And it talked all a lot about their rise and fall. And from what I understand, Pete, you started in university as a history major, but you didn't specialize in prehistoric American studies. So what was this first area of study that you went to university for, and what inspired you to change your focus to prehistoric North America?
So, yeah, that's right. I never took any classes on Indigenous history or Indigenous studies when I was in college. Now, since it was undergrad, I didn't specialize in one specific area of history. I have a very eclectic interest in history. So when I was in college, I did a lot of study on, took a lot of classes on ancient Rome. I even got to study abroad in the city, which was a really amazing experience, left a deep impression on me. I was also studying the German language at the time, so took a lot of German history classes, a lot of American history, a lot of Islamic history as well, weirdly enough. So, I didn't really specialize. I just kind of, fed a wide variety of interests. That said, I always did have a deep appreciation of ancient history growing up. So, when I was in elementary school, I did a school project on ancient Greece. That really kind of lit the flame. When I was older, got into Roman history, got into Byzantine history. So I guess like a lot of kids, it kind of started out with some of the more accessible ancient civilizations that kind of got me interested in it. Now, in regards to why I don't even want to say pivoted away, because I still really enjoy studying those civilizations and cultures. But what inspired me to start the channel is many years ago, I was I got a set of audio lectures on Mesoamerica. If you're familiar with the great courses, Dr. Ed Barnhart has a big lecture course on Mesoamerican history. And I remember getting that and thinking, I don't know much about Mesoamerica besides the Aztecs, a little bit about the Maya. And so as I listened to that, I was just floored at how little I knew about it and just how diverse all the history, the culture was, and how rich it was. And that really kind of that made me aware that there was just this massive blind spot in my knowledge of ancient history. And when you realize that you have a huge blind spot in a subject, you kind of start asking why no one ever brought it to your attention. This stuff was interesting to me. Why did I never learn this? I mean, sure, you learn about, the Aztec, the Inca, and the Maya. Nobody, as far as I know, in the public school system is ever going to teach you about the Moche or Zapotec, Hohokam, or like the Mississippians or anything. You're just kind of expected to, I don't know, maybe learn it on a field trip or something. So I really wanted to explore that ancient history in a lot more detail. I wanted to learn more about it and present it. At the time when I was coming up with this idea, I wasn't aware of any podcasts or channels that specialized in, ancient history in North and South America. I mean, I know now that there were. I was just inept at finding them. But at the time, I was kind of like, oh, no one's talking about this. I should create like a podcast about this. And then, podcast eventually morphed into a channel. I kind of realized that, you need to be able to, there needs to be a visual aspect to the show. You need to be able to, show certain artifacts, certain art styles. You need to be able to show the architecture to talk about it. So, yeah, that's kind of the reason. It's kind of why I started it, how it all came together.
And I think anyone who hears any of your episodes, especially on, like you were mentioning, the Hohokam or Cahokia on the Mississippi, will realize that there's a real attention to detail in every aspect of the video, whether it's the analysis of the society and their culture, or whether it's the representation of their art and their society in the way they worshipped versus the way they lived, and that's one of the reasons why your channel especially was so inspiring, at least to this podcast getting started. It was one of the first, like you were saying, that I was aware of as well, that was really focusing on specifically American history. A lot of other channels or YouTubers focus on a very general sort of thing. That's what I do, because my ADHD is just too all over the place. I will be very bored very quickly if I stick to one thing, so I have to keep changing it up every single time. But you have such a great way of stick-toing. You have a stick-to-itiveness when it comes to covering the North American indigenous peoples, and it shows a real respect and a real care for them and their culture, and also for representing them in a way that's probably not represented, especially not in popular media, but even in some historic media, where there are certain people who are trying to say, oh, this is Atlantis, this is aliens, this is that. So that's one of the great things about your channel.
No, thanks.
No problem. If I could just ask a quick follow-up based on what you just said, what was like that first moment when you were a kid that really got you interested in history? For me, when I was like 5 or 6 years old, it was being shown a globe, like a standard globe, and it was pointing to the different countries and asking one of my mom's friend, who was a history buff, did these two countries go to war? Did these two go to war? Did these two go to war? And from that, it's really funny, but that's really what it was. And the thing that I'll always remember is that I pointed to India and then to Great Britain, and I said, this is going to stump her. This is what's going to get her. These two have never been to war. I know it in my soul. Look at how far away they are on the map. But it turns out they were quite involved with each other. and the same goes for Spain and Latin America, etc., etc. So yeah, what was your first, as a kid, this is inspiring, this is what I want to pursue, this is what I want to do?
So, interestingly enough, the first historical topic that I remember getting really into as a kid was actually the Titanic, the ship. And I must have been, I'm trying to remember how old I was. I must have been about like 6 or 7 years old. My mom had gone to the library and just gotten me like a book about the Titanic, and it was really cool. It had like a lot of like awesome pictures, a lot of like charts about the ship, and she would, sit down and read that to me. I thought it was just super fascinating, and just the idea that there's like this old ship that was the biggest ship in the world, and it's on the ocean bottom, and like people rediscovered it, and it's still there, and you can see it, like, it kind of transports you back in time. And that was the first thing that really, that kind of like really started triggering my interest in it. And then throughout like elementary school and stuff, anytime we had, like school projects involving history, oh, you got to do a presentation about like this historical figure or, this historical culture. Like, those were always my jam. I loved those. I got really into them. The thing that probably sealed the deal, honestly, was probably when I studied in Rome. I mean, I just really kind of fell hard for ancient history. I mean, that was a really informative experience, and I kind of knew thereafter, like, oh yeah, I just want to study this, read about it, learn about it as much as I can.
That's really cool. Yeah, and where else but Rome to get really interested in ancient history?
I would highly recommend it.
So branching off on what you just said, you started this YouTube channel. It's been a huge success. It has something like almost 300,000 subscribers at this point. What is your process in planning and starting an episode? Do you just like wait till the last second and then throw it up against the wall, see what sticks? Or what, is there a deliberate process? How does that work?
So I have a list of topics that I find interesting. It's actually it's not even a list. It's like a massive spreadsheet. I'm trying to think. I counted it up one time. There was like over 100 potential topics. So picking a topic is actually pretty simple. I just ask myself, do I find this topic interesting? It's always yes. The second thing that I have to do is to make sure I have enough sources to do good research on it. It's, like any episode is possible as long as you have the right sources. Some sources might be very hard to access. They might be in other languages. In those cases, that makes things very, very challenging. Thankfully, now I do have a research assistant who can, help me out with like Spanish sources. His Spanish is much better than mine. So, like, for example, the Muisca episode that we did last year, like, I had that on my radar for years. I mean, I found Muisca culture very, very fascinating. I just found it like a very unappreciated moment in history, and finding English sources for it was almost impossible. It was so difficult. But then when I finally had somebody that could help me with the research and like going through the Spanish sources, then it all finally came together. Now, as far as the research process itself, so this is going to sound like really wacky, but hear me out. One of the first things I do kind of after I identify the main sources I'm going to use, typically I'll have like a main book that covers, the location, the culture, or the person in detail. But once I get those, I like to go to Wikipedia and just read the article about them or about that topic. Not because like I'm actually trying to get information, but it's really useful to use it to kind of establish a baseline for what is easily available to the public. Where's the bar gonna be set? So, and not only that, if you find something like really weird on Wikipedia, you can always like, try to, track down the source, kind of like see, okay, who's researched this? I'm going to go out and find like, their work on this topic. So, it's a nice little jumping off point. I always tell people, like, Wikipedia is a great place to start. It's a horrible place to finish. So, yeah, I mean, get your sources together, make sure that, the authors are credentialed and that they know what they're talking about. Ideally, I try to keep books and articles that are within the last, 20 years, ideally. It's not a deal breaker, but, I've gotten, bit before where I used an older source and then drop a video and then someone in the comments is like, oh, hey, you didn't mention this recent, archaeological site. And then I look it up and I'm like, oh my gosh, that would have been so good to know. Another place that you can find really good sources is YouTube. Not YouTube videos, but if you look up public lectures by professors or other experts on a topic, you find some amazing stuff out there. And what's more is that, if those authors specialize in something, then you can kind of look and see what else they've done. Do they have any books? Do they have any articles that goes into more detail? And speaking of experts, if I can find an expert to, reach out to and to kind of help me with the research or just to check my work once I've got the script done, that's really, really helpful as well. So for the the Great Plains episode, for example, I came across Carlton Shield Chief Gover, who runs the Ancient History of the Great Plains podcast. He knows, ancient history of the Great Plains better than I'm ever going to know it. So I got in touch with him. He was super helpful, gave me a lot of great tips about what sources to use when I got my first draft of my script. He looked over it, gave really good feedback. And as a result, I think that turned out really, really well. The research and script writing, I would say it really depends on the topic. I mean, some are pretty straightforward. You can kind of hammer them out in 4 weeks or something. Other times it's a very challenging topic. It can take 3 to 4 months or even longer than that. I mean, I think the Maya Collapse episode I did, I basically worked on that script on and off for a year. That was just a really challenging one to do. Now, for the record, I know I'm making it sound like a grind, but actually the research, the writing is the most fun part of the process. Your imagination can really run wild. You're really drawing a lot of inspiration. Once you get to actually recording the script and animating the whole thing, that's the grind. And I would say if everything goes well, you can get that done in about 2 weeks, maybe a little longer. So yeah, that's what the process looks like. I hope I didn't go into too much detail there, but
no, that was a
lot.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Yeah, I agree. Wikipedia is a great place to start, but to finish there is probably not the best way to go.
Yeah, if you're finishing at Wikipedia, it means you didn't do much.
Yeah, you did the bare minimum. You started with TikTok videos, and then you worked your way up to Wikipedia.
Here's Wikipedia, the font of all knowledge. And that's another thing. And that's another thing. It's funny because I've come across stuff on Wikipedia where I'm oh, that's really interesting. I haven't read that in any of my research so far. And then, you try to track down the source and you can't find it, or it's just a really, really shady source. And you kind of realize, oh, this article's probably wrong, or at the very least, this claim in it is unsubstantiated. So yeah, you always have to be, very critical of what you read on Wikipedia as well. So yeah, do more research than Wikipedia, kids. There's a lot of good stuff out there. Lots of professors and experts. They want you to learn this stuff. They write great books for you. Stick to those.
So I've done a little bit of research on both the Taínos and the ancestral Puebloans, and there seems to be several hallmark years which immensely affected the entirety of North America. So these were specifically during the 13th century and in the middle of the 15th century, just before European arrival. Do you believe there were other points at which major changes occurred that affected the entirety of North America? I mean, obviously there were points even before this which had serious ramifications for the entirety of the continent.
So that's a really good question. It's funny because you can point to pivotal moments, but a lot of times those aren't confined to like a specific date. So like a good example is the arrival of corn in the Southwest, in, Eastern North America. Those really, as corn gets adopted, it really transforms the society, but that unfolds over thousands of years. I think a better answer to the question is like the woodland to Mississippian transformation around 900 to 1000, and again that kind of ties into the arrival of corn, but that's when Cahokia, and Mississippian culture really take off and really start booming. And in the Southwest, that's kind of when Chaco Canyon is also in its heyday. I mean, technically it dates a little earlier than that. Now, I don't think there's anything that like specifically ties them together, but that like century and a half is a very interesting moment because so much is happening, is happening everywhere. And what is happening is going to have a big influence on the centuries to come. And then if you want to kind of pull the camera back even further, I mean, that's early post-classic in Mesoamerica. So that's like, the Toltecs heyday. That's like when Chichen Itza is kind of in its prime as well. So, and again, like, these are cultures that kind of have like, very long-lasting impact in their respective areas. So I think that's a good date. There are probably other candidates as well. For me, it's hard to hone in on one because, there's just such a huge amount of diversity among people and cultures. And you already picked out two good ones with, the 13th century. I'm sure drought hits the Southwest, and that forces like a lot of reorganization in like the Southwest and the Puebloan communities and stuff. So, but yeah, that's kind of a hard question to answer.
That's fair. But just branching off about the 13th century, this is something I've researched and I've tried to find more information about, but I haven't been able to really. Not anything super verifiable. But around the same time, it was just the beginning of the Little Ice Age, if I'm not mistaken. It might have started just after that, or maybe it started right around there. But how much of a factor do you think that the Little Ice Age played in the Southwest specifically? Because I've tried to link it to arroyo cuttings and things like this, but I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist or something. I'm like, look, the arroyos, they're being cut at the same time as the Little Ice Age started. I don't know how much correlation is between the two. But I just wanted to run that by you. If you don't have an answer, that's fine.
That's a really good question. I haven't really dived into that, so I can't really give you a good answer. And actually, one thing that I'll say about like climate data is, and I'm not trying to like, poo-poo on client science and everything. It's, super important. I think it's very informative. But I find it interesting how many times I've read about the end of a culture and they're like, oh, well, there's this climate change and everything, or like there's this drought, or like, something like that. And I'm always kind of struck because I'm like, but people deal with drought all the time. They deal with weather changes all the time. Some years get a lot of rain, some years get very little rain, and yet, people soldier on. These are full-time farmers. They know how to make adjustments and stuff. So while there are times where I think you can make very compelling cases that, okay, there's a climatic shift, it unfolds like this, and now you know, before this kind of farming, these kind of resources would have been abundant, and now they're not. So, the entire way of life is threatened or it needs to adjust. When you can make a really strong case like that, I'm much more inclined to it. But when people just say like, oh, there was a change in climate, I, kind of always want to be like, but, there are changes all the time. There are always good and bad years. Now, in the Southwest in the 1300s, like, that's a really bad prolonged drought. That's, already in a pretty marginal area. So that's one instance where, yeah, the climate probably is playing a very big part in what's going on there. Whether or not it's linked to the Little Ice Age, that's a better question for a climatologist.
Yeah. I agree. Of all the people that you've researched, that you've done a video on, that you've even just, glanced at the Wikipedia page of, who are some of your favorites and why?
So, oh man, I'm probably going to have to give you like a politician's answer here, but it's kind of true. I mean, I've enjoyed researching, all the topics I've covered immensely. I mean, every different culture, every different site is really interesting in its own ways. But if I had to pick, favorites among my children, the Maya, I'm endlessly fascinated by. I always love researching the Maya. I think the art's very beautiful. I can just get lost in it and just go through the Wikimedia galleries for days. The episode about Monkashtape, that one I never knew about until I until I found a Reddit post where somebody mentioned it, and I was like, wait, is this for real? And then looked it up and was like, oh, I have to make an episode about this. This guy is so fascinating. One episode in particular that kind of surprised me the most was the Dorset culture episode. And if I can kind of go on a tangent, so for those who don't know, the Dorset culture was basically a culture that inhabited most of the Arctic in Canada and Greenland, and it's a pre-Inuit culture, so it predates the modern Inuit people's migrations into the Arctic. So I didn't pick out that episode. I let my patrons vote on it. Somebody recommended it, and I remember thinking, oh, well, like, they're voting between this and, like, Chaco Canyon and Hopewell and some other topic, and I was like, those other three are way more interesting. There's no way that this is going to get chosen. And it won in a landslide, and I was like, oh, no. I know where this culture was, when it was, and I don't know anything else about it. So I ended up getting this big book on Arctic archaeology, and I was blown away at how fascinating, like, the archaeology of the Arctic is, the cultures that were living there, how they eked out a living, and how they thrived for so long. I mean, my mind was just getting blown left and right, over and over again. And so that episode was really fun because I had my expectations really low. I was worried that I wasn't going to have enough material for it. And that ended up being one of my favorite episodes. I really, really liked that one.
We're going to have a little thought experiment here. Imagine you're brought in front of Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and they say, Pete, we need you to give us a reason why we should fund indigenous research, why we should preserve indigenous languages and preserve indigenous lands. What argument would you make to them to advance this pursuit?
Well, I'd probably tell them to ask, somebody who actually is indigenous first and foremost, but if nobody else was available and time was limited, what I would probably stress to them is that this is something I think that has a lot of value, not just to us, but just humanity collectively. I mean, culture, language, these are humanity's ultimate expression of creativity and knowledge and shared experiences. And, when we learn about other cultures, we learn a lot about ourselves as humans. I mean, I think it's very, very enriching, at least it is to me. And when cultures, disappear or we forget about them, we lose a lot of that creativity and experience. And I think we're for the poor of it. And indigenous people, like just from my own experience, I mean, they're, connected to the land in a very deep way. The way they talk about it is so much different than the way, most, European descended people are. And I think it's, safe to say, I mean, I don't want to stereotype or generalize too much here, that most of them have a far greater appreciation for it. I'm always taken aback by, the reverence they have for it, the wisdom that they've cultivated from it. Yeah, I think that, we're richer as a group when these cultures are promoted and preserved. And then when you look at these cultures back in time, I think that, there's also just like a lot of interesting historical lessons you can look at. I mean, when I research, different topics, different people and cultures, I try to be aware of the challenges that they faced and how they faced those challenges, because that's the story of humanity, how we overcome challenges. We have challenges in, our own world. So when you read about how people survive in a marginal environment, how society changes when authority breaks down, how have people adapted to climatic change, how are societies resilient in the face of opposition and conquest, and not all these stories have happy endings. Some of them are triumphs and some of them are tragedies, but there's a lot that we can learn from those experiences. And, especially with, I mean, I don't want to get too political here or anything, but, whenever I hear certain, whenever I hear, certain, pundits, political figures, kind of talk about indigenous people, who is it? Yeah, Rick Santorum several years ago, like, made a comment about like how, they weren't really doing anything with the land or whatever, and it created like a big backlash. Whenever I hear stuff about that, like, I'm always just struck at how pessimistically indigenous experience is dismissed by these people. I was recently reading a book that mentioned in a very offhand manner how like Native Americans had no concept of democracy. And I was really struck by that because it's like, no, there are traditions of representative government in different Native American cultures. I mean, for sure, not all of them, but you can find plenty of examples out there. Sure, it's not, Western Athenian democracy, but, what other government now or past in the ancient world ever was besides Athens? And it's a shame because, how Native people thought about how decisions should be made, how power should be shared, about like how society should be ordered, what made good politics and representation. Like, these can teach us good lessons. They can, inspire good political virtues in us, So I'm sorry for the long-winded answers. Probably way more than
that was amazing. And maybe a lot of people still hold these ideas that, they weren't using the land properly, or they didn't have representative systems of government. I mean, there's only so many ways governments can function, and that's certainly one of them. Obviously, there is something to be said for the hereditary rule of kings, which I'm sure happened all across Mesoamerica and places like that. But then there are also examples like the whole Kham, which I've spoken with Steve Lexon, And he's basically said there is no hard evidence one way or the other that they had a clearly defined hierarchical leadership structure. They may
Hmm.
have had some very basic one where, okay, one person was in charge of this section of the canal and then another person, but they were all chosen via the community. There were no ostentatious burials or ostentatious buildings or things like this.
Hmm.
And people have argued stuff about, or people have argued the same thing about Chaco and about Mesa Verde,
Hmm.
and just branching off of that, the Chaco great houses are a huge subject of debate. A lot of people say, oh, they were used for this, they were used for that, they were used for this, that, and the other thing. In my opinion, I think that they probably were mansions or palaces for an elite. It doesn't. All the other theories I've seen haven't really held a lot of water for me personally, but maybe my opinion's a little skewed. I'm very much a team Steve Lexon guy. But what's your opinion on that, Pete? On the
Okay.
great houses specifically?
So, yeah, as soon as you started saying that, I was like, okay, you've definitely read Steve Lexon, because I know that he pushes that position pretty hard, and I love reading Steve Lexon. Like, his books are an absolute joy to read. He's got like a fantastic amount of experience. Um, that said, I'm open to the idea that that Chaco Canyon could have functioned as like a palace or like elite residence. The problem that I have with this, and this is kind of what every Chaco theory has to contend with, is that there's really conflicting evidence. There's not a lot of evidence that many people were living at Chaco. If you look at the number of burials, you look at the number of trash bins, you look at the number of hearths, there's just not that much there. Now, like, many of the people that are there are related. There's a matrilineal connection that kind of suggests that, there is some sort of family or clan that has a special role at Chaco. So I imagine somebody who's pushing for, the palace or elite structure theory is going to, lean very heavily on that evidence. That said, there is something of a middle ground where maybe Chaco's what's called a disembedded capital, where you have like lots of communities that are supporting a capital city that can't really support itself. So something like Montiel Bon in the Valley of Oaxaca, like they couldn't grow enough food for themselves. They had to like have communities on the valley floor support them. So maybe that's possible with Chaco. I mean, I know it's not the easiest, part of the world to grow corn. That said, there's a lot of other ideas. I mean, people have talked about how Chaco may have been a ceremonial center where it's uninhabited most of the year, and then people are coming in at certain times of the year for certain ceremonies or certain events, or maybe that it's like a trade area where like there's a lot of goods being stored and redistributed, or that it's a defensive place where, there's a lot of danger, people are coming together, and they're basically hunkering down because there's protection in numbers. And then on top of, just the archaeological evidence, the archaeological theories, you have a lot of oral traditions from different Pueblo groups and like the Dene and stuff. And those tend to suggest that when you listen to those stories, they tend to suggest that, like, Chaco Canyon ended on a bad note, or a sour note, I should say. You could really go in any direction. I'm not dead set on a specific on a specific idea. I think all of these ideas have merit. I don't think that they're all exclusive. I guess I'm okay with the ambiguity of Chaco Canyon. It doesn't need to be something specific. But like I said, I think that, kind of exploring those different theories, there's like a lot of really interesting points that people, bring up, a lot of interesting evidence that they lean on. I realize this is, anticlimactic answer, but it's kind of how I look at it.
That's totally fair. Yeah, and it seems like with a lot of theorization about Chaco and the great houses especially, that there is it changes which with each generation. Like this generation is talking about climate change and inequality and palaces, when a few generations ago it was talking about, there was this reactionary, everyone got crazy because they ate too much corn. These are the theories that were pushed a few generations ago. And if you go back even farther, there are even more speculative reasons. And I think it's interesting that archaeology and history kind of always functions based on the current researchers' mindset or their current feelings on what's happening in the world today. It's very interesting that there is that sort of backlog.
Yeah, I agree completely. Like occasionally I'll tell this to people, but it's like we as I think like, kind of a greater society, we like to project ourselves back onto the past. So our struggles, our anxieties, our values in a lot of ways are projected onto ancient people who, most likely did, had some of those anxieties, maybe a lot more. But yeah, I completely agree with you. Like, you see things change a lot, and a lot of times, a lot of interpretations are very much colored by what's happening in society as a whole.
So one of Chaco's distant neighbors was the metropolis of Cahokia on the Mississippi. Now, you made a masterful video on the mountain builders, as they were formerly known. We know they traded certain goods with each other. I'm talking about Cahokia and Chaco / the Puebloans. But how extensive do you think the connection was? And how much contact do you believe these early North American societies had with each other?
I think that they had a lot of contact with one another, and I realize that might be a bit of a spicy take, but, you look in the archaeology of, not just Cahokia, but like, other sites like, like Moundville or like Poverty Point, and you find goods that are coming from very far distances. You find copper that's coming from the Great Lakes. You find galena that's coming up from Missouri. You find mica that's coming from the southeast, or like catlinite from Minnesota, shells from the coast. There's a obsidian blade that was found at a Hopewell site, and it's escaping me which one it is. But they basically sourced that obsidian all the way to Wyoming. Now, how all of that is being moved, that's anybody's guess. I mean, I doubt people were, regularly making these long cross-country trips up and down the river to get specific goods. A lot of that, I would guess, is kind of like moving down the line from like one person or one group to another. But even just that, I think, kind of attests to the idea that people knew what was beyond their borders. I mean, they had to know that these materials came from specific regions, even if they had never been there. To make a comparison, think about medieval Europe. I imagine if you're, like if you're a lord or a knight living in medieval France, you probably have an imperfect idea of what's out east. But you'll know that silk, spices, elephants, that those are all coming from the east. So even if you've never been to China, even if you know no one that's gone out to China or India, you probably have a good idea that they're there, even if you can't get very specific about it. And so I would say, why can't that be true for Native Americans in North America? You know what I mean? Why couldn't they have had the same knowledge? I'm a big believer that, like the distance can be overcome. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody living in Chaco Canyon was aware that, if you go to the east and you cross over the plains, there's a huge river. It's got this really big city there where they make their mountains out of hand. And it's this, huge thriving place that would take you like a whole day just to walk through. I doubt they knew much beyond that. I'm sure they couldn't tell you much about the cultures, the leaders, or the politics. But, they probably had some vague awareness that it was. And another really interesting thing is that, during the colonial period, there's lots of examples of, Spanish, French, British, and American explorers who have native guides that are able to guide them over vast distances. So if you're familiar with the Coronado expedition, somewhere in the Southwest, and I forget exactly where, but Coronado basically captures or kidnaps this native that he calls the Turk.
El Turco.
And yeah, that's it. And basically wants him to take him and his expedition to Quivira, which is supposedly this, big, wealthy city out east. And surprise, surprise, they don't really find it. They just go into the plains. And then, you look at Lewis and Clark, they had Sacagawea. She was able to guide them, across the Mississippi, through the plains and everything. So, people clearly had knowledge of what was going on outside their immediate homes. It may not have been perfect, but it didn't need to be. It just had to be good enough. I mean, these people, I'm sure, were just as curious about their neighbors, what was beyond their neighbors, as we are today.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that a lot of these ideas that, they didn't interact with each other, they had this perfect little bubble where, if you intruded on this bubble and you were a different society, everyone just started stabbing each other. I think that a lot of these ideas are based in very 19th century, early 20th century racist, quite frankly, racist ideas where, native peoples were not of the same civilizational level as white people who obviously understood that there were German people and French people and Spanish people. But the same, for some reason, is not true just across the ocean in a very, diverse, multicultural tapestry of peoples which inhabited Mesoamerica, the Southwest, the Eastern Woodlands, the Mississippi Delta. I mean, this was a huge array of people, and we know, at least via trade, that they interacted. It seems substantially, and I agree with you. I think that there was a lot more interaction than even what people are speculating right now, because so much of these societies have decayed through the millennia. I mean, a lot of their societies were wooden, and wood decays unless it's in a place like the Southwest where it's so dry that there is no chance for the wood to decay in the natural way it does. So I think that has a lot to do with our preconceptions about, native peoples were only able to do this, they weren't able to do this. No, they were able to do the same things that we did, and they could probably do a lot more. I couldn't tell you, for example, when the next full moon is, just off the top of my head. But if you took someone from Chaco Canyon or from Cahokia, I think that there's a pretty good chance that they would be able to tell you instantaneously when the next full moon is or when the next new moon is. Not even just the full moon. I mean, they go months and months in advance, and they'd be able to give you a pretty good idea. So I think that they did interact a very large amount.
Yeah, I think it's also worth keeping in mind that, like, when you look at archaeology, you're really only looking at a sliver of the picture. So, if you're trying to reconstruct, like, ancient trade and contact, you're only going to have the things that don't decay or are not consumed by people. So, the evidence that we see in the archaeology may actually be a lot smaller than, the level of contact that existed in the past. I realize that's total speculation, but I think it's pretty reasonable.
Yeah, definitely. Because we're able to speculate that, like, there were Roman legions in China and things like this. I think we can speculate that one civilization, which was more or less next door to each other, interacted with this other civilization. I think that's far from a spicy take, as you phrased it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think probably the most fascinating, or one of the most fascinating aspects of the prehistoric North America is the original migrations of the first peoples and the debate over where exactly they came from, or if there were other peoplings of the Americas in later time periods, which we've talked about a little bit already. So some speculate that the first peoples traveled by land via Asia or via boats from the same location over the Bering Strait. Others speculate that they came from Polynesia. I think there's quite a large amount of evidence, at least by certain YouTubers I've watched, that seems to point to some sort of peopling from Polynesia at some time. I don't know if that's solidified hard evidence yet or what, but there seems to be a lot pointing to that. Well, I recently had on Bruce Bradley. He's the emeritus professor at Exeter University. He was on the show, and he he supports the Solutrine hypothesis. And this basically speculates that an early European-based population either used the ice of the last glacial maximum or went by boat to North America sometime 22,000 years ago. What is your take on these first migrations, and do any of these, save for the commonly held Siberian migrations, hold weight for you?
So, kind of like considering the whole body of evidence, which, is incomplete. I mean, we only know what archaeology has found. We only know genetic history as much as we've been able to test. But given what we know, I'm a big fan of the coastal migration theory personally, which is the idea that people sailed from Beringia or Northeast Asia down the coast into North America. I mean, I'm sure that would have been challenging, but it would have been possible. And the reasons that I lean that way is basically based on two lines of evidence. The first is the White Sands footprints. So for those who aren't aware, these are fossilized human footprints that were found in White Sands National Park, and they were dated to about 21,000 years ago. Now, only humans make human footprints, so that's, pretty hard to refute evidence. And they've dated those footprints in multiple ways. They've come back consistently. So it's a very, very strong line of evidence. The second line are the genetic studies that have been done on, ancient human remains in North and South America, as well as contemporary populations and ancient human remains in, Siberia and Northeast Asia. And they point to a genetic origin for modern indigenous people in Northeast Asia. Now, I'm simplifying a lot here. It's way more nuanced. If you want a good book on it, Jennifer Raffs has a really excellent book called Origin. Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas, that goes through it very thoroughly. It's really, really good. But looking at those, that's where I lean right now. Now, it's possible that, other populations could have come in earlier, but haven't left any genetic traces. It's possible that people might have come over the land bridge way earlier than 20,000 years ago, and maybe they came in 30 or 40,000 years ago before the ice sheets closed up during the last glacial maximum. Now, there hasn't really been any hard evidence to, back that up. I think you'd expect to find, much older dates than White Sands. There is actually some really tantalizing evidence in the United States. There have been excavations by a archaeologist named Ken Holin, I believe in Kansas and Nebraska, and he's found a couple of sites that have broken bones, and the way that they're broken, it suggests that it's not done by an animal. There might also be butcher marks, but again, there's no tools, there's no charcoal, there's no direct human evidence. So, if these, if these 30,000-year-old sites are human-made sites, that'd be really interesting, but we just can't prove it right now. The evidence is just circumstantial. But I think that those sites are really interesting. They don't get a lot of attention. Now, going back to what you said earlier, I mean, I've also heard people, at least I see it in my comment section, that people will talk about a Polynesian route to the Americas, and that's the initial settlement. So I'm not sure really why people are so into this idea, because if you look at the archaeology that's been done in Polynesia and across the Pacific, nobody was sailing across the Pacific. Nobody was hitting those islands until about, I think 4,000 years ago. There's just no earlier evidence than that. If somebody finds, a site on, Tahiti that's 10,000 years old, okay, we could, certainly look that up. I think one reason why people draw that conclusion is, I know there was a genetic study done several years back that pointed to a common genetic heritage between Indigenous Americans and Australasian populations. But I think people interpret that wrong, because they think oh, there's a link, they must have gone across the Pacific, and it's no, these people have, these people have a common origin. They're separate branches linked at the trunk, but the trunk is 50,000 years ago in East Asia. And then, the trunk splits. One group goes up into North America through Beringia, and the other group goes down to, into Indonesia and Australia. So I think people might be misinterpreting that. I'm not entirely sure, but, we could always find new evidence tomorrow. And then regarding, the most exciting possibility, the Solutrean hypothesis, I don't want to say something like that is impossible. Humans are very smart, they're very ingenious. They could figure out a way to cross the Atlantic, go by the glaciers and find their way to North America. I just think that I just don't think we have enough current evidence to substantiate that. And I'm sure if your listeners have, heard Dr. Bradley talk about this, they're probably familiar with his position. And, unlike me, he's a, accredited archaeology professor. He's way smarter than me. And I do agree with him that there are some really insane similarities between Clovis and Solutrean points. I mean, they both are made by pressure flaking, which is a lithic technique that's pretty rare. You don't see it come up that often. The problem for me, though, is that Solutrean points and culture dates to about 20,000 years ago. Clovis points are no older than like 12 to 13,000 years ago. They don't get any older than that. And so the question that what we're being asked to believe is that people cross over into North America, and they take their awesome Solutrean points, and then over time those Solutrean points stop being used, and like 5,000 years later, people in the United States are like, hey, like, why don't we start making Solutrean points again? Why don't we start, pressure flaking our points? And that's, supposed to be the link. I just, I have trouble reconciling that. Like I said, it's not impossible that happened. I just don't think it's very likely.
I concur. I think that there is some interesting genetic stuff when you compare European genetics to like a place like Puerto Rico, and this is just a super specific niche thing, but a lot of native Puerto Ricans have the R1 genome a part of their genetic makeup, and the R1 is a European, but it's a pre-European strain, but it's also found in places like Central Asia. So people speculate that, either, or at least this one author I've read, Dr. Richard Parada, he speculated that the first Vikings who came in the thousands, 1100s, they intermingled with the native Inuit people, and from there they moved on, or the native Algonquin people, I believe, and the Algonquin people slowly evolved into the Lakota, who took the Mississippi down, and then colonized Puerto Rico for the first time. So that's his theory. So in that case, that at least to me is interesting, but it doesn't point to any serious linkage between the two. At least none that I would feel comfortable saying, "Oh yes, this is it. This is what I'm willing to die on this hill for."
I mean, like I said, it's quite the idea. It's not impossible. I don't think it's that likely though.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It would be something, and it just shows that there's so much we still don't understand about Native North Americans, and the study of them is still very much shrouded in mystery. So much so that people can start claiming all kinds of wild things about native cultures and native peoples, like, oh, they didn't actually construct this. This was actually done by some super superior society, which built a great house over, it's such a superior society, Pete, that they took decades to construct a great house, which was only a few stories. That's how that's how scientifically advanced they were, Um, So, and that's not to discredit anything that the ancestral Puebloans did, or any of the native peoples did with their own architecture. It's all incredible, and it shows such a veracity and such a tenacious will that is so supremely human that I can't help but be awed by it whenever I see it, and it brings me so much more awe when I recognize that these were people just like you and me, who just lived a different sort of life, but still were able to construct all these monuments and prove for thousands of years that the land could be inhabited, that it could be tamed, and that it could be explored, which is what they did to begin with.
Absolutely, yeah. Humans are pretty incredible creatures.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they're voracious to the extreme, and they can be incredibly greedy, but they can also show incredible care, especially in this respect towards Mother Earth and the one planet that we only have. It's only the one. We haven't gotten to Mars yet. Unfortunately, Elon is still waiting for that prediction to come true. But as we finish up, is there anything specifically, Pete, that you'd like to discuss today that we maybe missed, that you're specifically very interested in? Anything like that at all?
No, I think this was really, really awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much. I had a lot of fun talking to you. I think that my audience would really enjoyed this conversation. I know I did. Before we finish up entirely, how can people find you? How can they find your work, your social media handles, etc., your plugs, all of it?
So the only social media I'm really active on is YouTube and Facebook. So on YouTube, it's just Ancient Americas. Just search that. You should find the channel. Do also have a Facebook page. Again, if you just search Ancient Americas, I post there sometimes. Yeah, you can find me at either of those places.
Yeah, and I can't stress enough how crucial your channel has been to the podcast, to this podcast specifically, and how important I think the work that you do is. If you haven't heard of Ancient Americas, you should stop everything you're doing. You should go and listen to an hour long video on a native society. And say I just want to say again, Pete, thank you so much, and thank you all so much for listening. I'm Joseph Pascone. This is the Turning Tides podcast. Have a great day.
If you like what you heard today, you can support us by donating on PayPal at Turning Tides Podcast 1. We would also appreciate it if you take the time to rate and review Turning Tides on whatever platform you use to listen, and share the show with your family and friends. It really helps us bring the show to more listeners. Thank you so much for the support, and thanks again for listening.